All right, ready to dive into some pretty intense immunology today?
Always.
We're talking about toll-like receptors, TLRs,
Ah, those little
the
guys.
tiny proteins on our cells. They're like an alarm system for our immune system.
Exactly.
And you sent over a ton of research on how these things can actually cause problems like, chronic inflammation,
Right.
sepsis,
Mm-hmm.
even tricking your immune system to turn against you.
Yeah, TLRs are really important for detecting threats. But when their signaling gets messed up, things can get pretty bad.
So we're going to try to figure out how TLRs work, what throws them off balance,
Okay.
and what it all means for diseases, especially autoimmunity. It's like a molecular detective story going on in our cells.
Exactly. And it all starts with, well, understanding that TLRs are guardians at the gate of our immune system.
Okay, break that down for me. If our cells are like these little fortresses, where do TLRs fit in?
Think of TLRs as sentries.
Okay,
They're posted on the fortress walls, constantly scanning for any sign of danger. They recognize specific molecular patterns that are unique to pathogens. We call those PAMPs.
PAMPs, okay, so those are like red flags. Intruder alert.
Exactly. And when a TLR runs into a PAMP, it triggers a whole chain reaction inside the cell, leading to the production of cytokines.
Cytokines, those are the signaling molecules
Right.
that call in the reinforcements,
Yeah.
other immune cells, to fight off the infection.
That's a great way to put it. It's a super efficient system that lets our bodies respond to infections quickly and accurately.
But you were saying earlier this system can go haywire. What happens when those TLR alarms are going off all the time, even when there's no real danger?
That's when you get chronic inflammation. Instead of a controlled response, the immune system is basically stuck on high alert.
Oh, I see.
It just keeps pumping out those inflammatory mediators even when there's no real threat.
So instead of calling in a couple of guards, it's like calling in the entire army for, like, a squirrel in the yard.
Haha, good analogy. And all that constant inflammation, it can really damage tissues and contribute to a whole bunch of diseases, heart disease, cancer, you name it.
And that brings us to one of the most serious consequences of TLR hyperactivation, sepsis.
Right, sepsis is basically a runaway immune response. The body's trying to fight off an infection, but it spirals out of control.
Oh, wow.
The infection triggers this massive flood of inflammatory mediators, especially the cytokines we were talking about before.
So it's not just regular inflammation. It's more like a wildfire, right? Just
Yeah.
ripping through the body.
Exactly. And that uncontrolled inflammation can lead to blood clots, organ damage, and if it's not treated quickly, even death.
That's terrifying. And to make things even more complicated, TLRs can actually contribute to autoimmunity, where the
Mhm.
immune system attacks the body's own tissues.
Right. Sometimes TLRs can mistakenly recognize parts of our own cells as foreign threats.
So they're raising the alarm, even though there's no actual outside invader.
Exactly. And that can cause chronic inflammation and damage to specific organs, which leads to a whole bunch of autoimmune diseases.
So understanding what goes wrong in TLR signaling is really important, especially if we want to develop good treatments for these conditions.
Absolutely.
It's like we have to understand how the alarm system is wired before we can fix it.
Exactly. And that's where TLR antagonists come in. These are molecules that can block TLR signaling. They basically hit the snooze button on that overactive alarm system.
So instead of the immune system being on high alert all the time, these antagonists help to calm things down a bit.
Precisely. And that makes them really promising as potential treatments for a bunch of TLR-driven diseases.
But figuring out exactly which TLRs are causing the problem for a specific disease, I imagine that's no easy task. It's like finding a single faulty wire in a massive electrical system.
That's a good way to think about it. It's like solving a cellular mystery. Researchers are really meticulously tracking the different ways TLR hyperactivation happens and how it all contributes to different diseases.
So they're like molecular detectives, right? They're
Right.
trying to gather clues to figure out which TLR is the culprit.
Exactly. It's a complicated and challenging area of research, but it has huge potential for developing new and effective treatments.
Now, you mentioned the different TLRs can recognize distinct PMPs. Does that mean that some TLRs are more likely to be involved in certain diseases?
That's a great question. It's definitely an area of active research. For example, we know that TLR4 is really good at recognizing LPS,
LPS.
lipopolysaccharide. It's a component of certain bacteria. So TLR4 is a key player in our immune response to those bacteria.
I see.
But it also means TLR4 could be involved when things go wrong, like in sepsis.
So knowing which TLRs are involved in specific diseases could really help us develop more targeted therapies, right?
Absolutely. It's all about moving beyond a one-size-fits-all approach. We want to develop treatments that are tailored to the specific molecular mechanisms driving each disease.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, before we get too deep into the weeds of all the specific TLRs and their roles in different diseases, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, immune tolerance.
Oh, right.
Can you remind me what that is again?
Immune tolerance is the immune system's ability to tell the difference between self and non-self,
Okay,
to recognize what belongs to the body and what doesn't.
got it. So it's like having a security system that knows the difference between the people who live in the house and a burglar trying to break in.
Perfect analogy. And being able to tolerate our own tissues is absolutely crucial for preventing autoimmune diseases.
So how do TLRs fit into this whole idea of immune tolerance?
Well, TLRs are involved in both starting an immune response and in regulating it. They're not just simple on-off switches. They're part of this really complex network of signals that help fine-tune the immune response.
So they're kind of like helping to train the immune system to recognize what's safe and what's dangerous.
Exactly. And when that training goes wrong, when tolerance breaks down, that's when we see autoimmune diseases develop.
This brings up a fascinating question. What causes that tolerance to break down in the first place?
That's a question scientists are still trying to figure out completely, but it seems like it's a combination of genetics and environmental factors.
So genetics, meaning some people might just be born with a higher risk of developing autoimmunity.
Right. Certain genes can make the immune system more likely to mistake the body's own proteins as being foreign.
And environmental factors? What kind of things are we talking about?
It could be anything, really. Infections, exposure to certain chemicals, even stress.
Huh.
Those environmental triggers can sometimes set off a chain reaction that eventually leads to a breakdown in tolerance.
This is all so complicated. I'm starting to realize just how much is going on behind the scenes of our immune system.
It really is. And we're just scratching the surface of understanding how TLRs, immune tolerance, and environmental factors all work together to affect our health, and how likely we are to get sick.
This is already a lot to process, but I am curious to hear more about some specific examples of TLRs gone wrong. Are there certain TLRs that are notorious for causing problems?
Oh, yeah, definitely. For instance, TLR7 and TLR9, which are found inside immune cells, are known to play a big role in autoimmune diseases like lupus.
Yeah.
They're supposed to recognize viral and bacterial DNA, but sometimes they mistakenly target our own DNA.
So it's like mistaking a blueprint for like an enemy's battle plans.
That's a great way to put it. And that mistaken identity is a key driver of the inflammation and tissue damage that happen in lupus.
This is so fascinating. But I have to admit, I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed with all this molecular detail. Can we zoom out for a second and talk about the bigger picture?
Sure. What would you like to explore?
Well, you mentioned before that TLR antagonists are promising as potential treatments for TLR-driven diseases. Are there any TLR antagonists already being used in medicine?
There are a few. For example, there's a drug that targets TLR4. It's already being used to treat severe sepsis. And other TLR antagonists are being investigated for use in all sorts of conditions, from autoimmune diseases to even cancer.
That's really exciting. It seems like we're just starting to tap into the potential of targeting TLRs for treatment.
Absolutely. And as we understand TLR signaling and immune tolerance better, I think we'll see even more innovative therapies emerge.
Okay, before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay.
You said that TLRs are like sentinels, constantly looking out for danger.
Right.
But what happens if they don't encounter enough threats?
Hmm.
Could our modern hygiene hypothesis, where we live in increasingly clean environments, actually be causing TLRs to, like, get bored and start causing trouble?
That's a very interesting question. Let's explore that in the next part of our discussion. I'm curious to hear what you think about it. It is a fascinating idea. Is our immune system maybe getting a little too eager without enough real threats to fight?
Yeah, like those overzealous security guards mistaking a stray cat for a burglar?
Well, there's a term for that, the hygiene hypothesis. Some scientists think the increase in autoimmune diseases and allergies we see today, it could be linked to that.
So instead of battling dangerous pathogens, our immune system's kind of turning on our bodies out of boredom?
It's a bit simplified, but yeah, you've got the general idea. The hygiene hypothesis suggests that early exposure to a bunch of different microbes, especially as kids, it's actually important for training the immune system. to know the difference between friend or foe.
So playing in the dirt and getting a little messy when we were kids, that was actually good for us.
More and more evidence is pointing in that direction. Of course, we still need to practice good hygiene to avoid infectious diseases, but it seems like a little exposure to dirt and microbes might actually be beneficial for training our immune systems.
It makes you think about how our understanding of the immune system is changing all the time.
Mm.
We used to think it was all about destroying invaders, but now we're seeing how important immune regulation and tolerance are.
Absolutely. It's not just about attacking everything that's foreign. It's about being able to tell what's actually harmful and what's not, and then responding appropriately.
And TLRs are clearly playing a big role in that whole balancing act.
Definitely. They're not just simple on-off switches. They're involved in these really complicated signaling pathways that help to modulate the immune response.
Speaking of signaling pathways, you sent over some research on cyclic AMP, CAMP, and its role in TLR signaling. Can you remind me what CAMP is and why it matters?
Sure. CMP is a signaling molecule. It's found basically everywhere in the body, and it's involved in a ton of different cellular processes. It plays a key role in how TLRs communicate within the cell.
So it's like a messenger that relays information from the TLRs to other parts of the cell.
Exactly. When a TLR is activated, it sets off a cascade of events that leads to higher CMP levels inside the cell.
And what does that increase in CAMP do?
It triggers a whole chain reaction, activating other molecules and pathways. For example, it activates protein kinase A, or PKA.
PKA.
Okay. Which is an enzyme. It basically acts like a switch, turning other proteins on or off.
So CAMP is like that first domino that sets off a cascade.
Mm-hmm.
And it ultimately affects how the cell behaves.
Great analogy. And this CAMP-PKA pathway is really important for regulating the production of cytokines, those inflammatory signaling molecules.
Ah, I see the connection. So by tweaking CAMP levels, we could potentially control the inflammatory response.
Exactly. In fact, there's a lot of research going on right now trying to develop drugs that target CAMP signaling pathways as potential treatments for inflammatory diseases.
Now, you also sent over some research on these things called CAMP signaling microdomains. What are those exactly?
This is where things get really cool. For a long time, scientists thought that CAMP just spread out evenly throughout the cell.
So when CAMP levels went up, it was like flooding the whole cell with a message.
Right. But it turns out it's more complicated than that.
Okay, I'm listening.
Well, it seems like there are these specialized compartments within the cell, these microdomains, where CMP levels can be much higher than in the areas around them.
So instead of a uniform spread, it's more like having little pockets of concentrated CAMP inside the cell.
Exactly. And we think these microdomains are associated with specific cell structures, like the plasma membrane or certain organelles, which means it allows for much more precise control over how the cell responds.
So instead of a global flood, it's more like targeted irrigation, delivering the message exactly where it's needed.
Another great analogy. And this localized signaling could be really important for how cells respond to all kinds of stimuli, including the ones from TLRs.
That is fascinating. Do you think there could be a link between this disruption of CAMP microdomains and the TLR hyperactivation we were talking about before?
It's a really good question, and it's something researchers are looking into. There's some evidence that suggests messing with CAMP signaling could contribute to TLR hyperactivation.
So instead of having these well-organized pockets of CAMP, maybe in some cases we see this widespread, uncontrolled increase in CAMP levels.
Right.
And that leads to this overblown inflammatory response.
Exactly. And that disruption in the localized signaling, it could be a key factor in how chronic inflammatory diseases and even autoimmune disorders develop.
Wow. It's amazing how these tiny molecules and all their complicated interactions can have such a huge impact on our health. It really makes you realize just how much is going on inside every single cell in our bodies.
It really is. And we've only just begun to understand the complexities of these cellular processes.
Okay, before we go any further, I want to switch gears a bit. Let's talk about something you mentioned earlier, thyroid hormone receptors, TRs. You said they play a crucial role in brain development, right?
They do. Thyroid hormone is essential for a lot of neurological processes, like neuronal migration and synapse formation, all super critical for a healthy brain.
So if there's not enough thyroid hormone during those key times of brain development, it can have serious consequences.
Absolutely. Cognitive problems, developmental delays, even intellectual disabilities.
That's scary. But where does the TRs come in?
TRs are basically transcription factors. They control which genes get turned on or off. In the brain, they regulate the expression of genes that are essential for neurons to grow, differentiate, and function properly.
So they're like the conductors of an orchestra, making sure that all the instruments are playing in harmony and at the right time.
Beautifully put. And without the right cues from the TRs, the whole symphony can fall apart.
You also mentioned there are different types of TRs. Are they all equally important for brain development?
It seems like Trio 1, one of the subtypes, is particularly critical. Studies have shown that mice that don't have Trio 1, they have really severe neurological problems, like impaired motor skills, learning difficulties, even hearing loss.
So it's like a key instrument missing from the orchestra. The whole performance is thrown off. It really shows just how important Trio 1 is for a healthy brain.
Exactly, and that's driving a lot of research into potential therapies. Scientists are looking at using TR agonists, molecules that activate TRs, as possible treatments for a bunch of neurological conditions like stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and even autism.
That's incredible. It sounds like we're just beginning to understand how powerful targeting these receptors could be. It makes me wonder, could there be a connection between TLRs and TRs in the brain, given their roles in immunity and development? Could TLR activation somehow affect TR signaling, or the other way around?
That's a really insightful question. It's something that researchers are starting to look into. There's some early evidence that suggests there might be crosstalk between these two pathways.
Crosstalk. So the two pathways could be communicating with each other and influencing each other's activity.
Exactly. It's like having two separate orchestras performing in the same concert hall, but the conductors are occasionally signaling to each other. This crosstalk could be important for coordinating the immune response and how neurons function in the brain.
That's amazing. To think that all these complicated molecular conversations are happening in our brains all the time.
It's pretty remarkable, isn't it? And it just goes to show how much we still don't know about how complex the human body is.
I'm definitely feeling a bit overwhelmed, but also really inspired by all this new knowledge. Before we jump into anything else, it might be helpful to recap what we've covered so far. Today, we've explored the fascinating world of toll-like receptors, TLRs, those molecular sentinels guarding our cells from infection.
And we've talked about how they can be both protective and potentially harmful. When their signaling gets out of whack, it can lead to things like chronic inflammation, sepsis, and even autoimmune diseases.
We also talked about the hygiene hypothesis and how our super clean modern lifestyles might be playing a role in this immune system dysregulation.
Right, and we explored all the complexities of CAM-P signaling, those intricate communication pathways inside our cells, and the idea of CAM-P microdomains, where signaling is really finely tuned and localized.
And we touched on how important thyroid hormone receptors, or TRs, are in brain development, and how researchers are looking into their potential as therapeutic targets for all sorts of neurological conditions.
It's been a whirlwind tour of molecular biology.
It really has. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one last thought. We've been talking about how TLRs get triggered by these molecular signatures from invaders, the PAMPs.
Yes, those red flags that alert the immune system.
But what if there are other kinds of molecular patterns that can also trigger TLRs? Patterns that aren't from pathogens, but instead they're signals of cellular stress or damage from within our own bodies.
That's a fantastic question. It turns out there are. They're called damage-associated molecular patterns, or DAMPs.
DAMPs. Tell me more.
Yeah.
What are they and how do they trigger TLRs?
Well, DAMPs are molecules that our own cells release when they're damaged or stressed. Think of them as distress signals. They can be things like DNA fragments, heat shock proteins, or even ATP, the energy currency of the cell.
So like our cells are sending out a mayday when they're in trouble, and TLRs are listening in.
Exactly. And those distress signals, those DAMPs, can activate TLRs, which triggers an immune response.
But wouldn't that be kind of counterproductive? Why would our own cells trigger an immune response against themselves?
It's not about attacking healthy cells. It's more about promoting tissue repair and healing.
Oh, okay. I'm interested. How does that work?
When TLRs are activated by DAMPs, it triggers the release of cytokines and those other inflammatory mediators. But in this case, inflammation isn't a bad thing. It helps plug immune cells to the area where the damage is, clear away debris, and help the tissue regenerate.
So it's like calling in a cleanup crew and construction workers to fix the damage after a storm.
Perfect analogy. We think this DAMP TLR pathway is really important for wound healing, tissue remodeling, and even recovering from things like a stroke.
This is so fascinating. It seems like TLRs are even more versatile than we initially thought. They're not just about fighting off invaders, they're also involved in keeping our tissues healthy and promoting healing.
Absolutely. They're part of this really complex system that helps our bodies deal with a whole range of challenges, both from the outside and the inside.
Well, this has been an incredible journey into the world of TLRs, TRs, and even a little bit of glycine receptor talk. We've explored their roles in immunity, inflammation, brain development, and even tissue repair. What a wild ride.
It has been. It just shows how much we still have to learn about these fascinating molecules and all their interactions.
But I think our brains need a break from all this molecular detail. Let's shift gears in the next segment and explore something totally different, something a little lighter but still incredibly fascinating.
I'm all for that. My neurons could definitely use a little recharge. What do you have in mind?
Well, we've been talking a lot about how complex the immune system is, but what about the role of our senses in shaping our immune responses? Specifically, what about the sense of smell? You sent over some really interesting research on how certain scents can actually impact our immune function. I'm really curious to explore that.
Ah, yes, the olfactory system, our sense of smell, is much more connected to the immune system than most people realize. It's a fascinating area of research.
Perfect. Let's dive into that in our next segment. Okay, we're back. Ready to explore something I think is so cool, the connection between our sense of smell and the immune system. You were saying that the olfactory system, the part responsible for our sense of smell, it's more connected to immunity than most people realize.
That's right. It might seem strange, but the olfactory epithelium, that tissue in our nasal cavity with all the smell receptors, it's always exposed to the outside world. So it's like a first line of defense against stuff in the air, particles and pathogens.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Our noses are like the first point of contact for whatever's floating around out there. But how does that tie into the immune system?
Well, it turns out those olfactory receptors, the proteins that detect odor molecules, they can also detect certain microbial molecules.
Wait, so our noses aren't just smelling things, they're sensing the presence of microbes, too.
Uh-huh.
That's wild.
Exactly. And that microbial sensing can actually trigger immune responses right there in the nasal cavity.
Okay, tell me more. I'm hooked.
So when those olfactory receptors pick up on these microbial molecules, they can activate signaling pathways that lead to the production of antimicrobial peptides.
Antimicrobial peptides. Those are like the body's little soldiers that can take out bacteria and viruses directly, right?
You got it. It's like our noses are these tiny chemical warfare factories churning out these antimicrobial peptides to fight off invaders.
That is so cool. I
Yeah.
never thought about my sense of smell as being so actively involved in protecting me from getting sick. But it gets even weirder, right? You mentioned that certain scents can actually mess with our overall immune function, not just in the nose.
Yeah, there's more and more evidence suggesting that some odor molecules can get into the bloodstream. They travel to other parts of the body and actually interact with immune cells. It's like this direct line of communication between what's out there in the world and our immune system, all thanks to our sense of smell.
So scents are like little messengers, carrying information about the environment to our immune system. That's amazing. What kind of effects can those scent messengers have?
We think they play a role in a lot of things, from wound healing to how our bodies respond to stress.
This is blowing my mind. It makes you think about whether we could use scents therapeutically, to deliberately influence the immune system.
That's definitely something that's got researchers really interested. One area they're looking into is essential oils.
Essential oils, they're everywhere these days. Are you saying there might be real medicinal benefits behind those nice smells?
Well, there's a ton of anecdotal evidence out there, and scientists are starting to investigate how those supposed benefits actually work.
Okay, let's get into specifics. What kind of essential oils are we talking about, and what kind of immune effects are we seeing?
One that's been studied a lot is tea tree oil. It's famous for its antimicrobial properties. Studies have shown it can stop the growth of bacteria, fungi, and even viruses.
Tea tree oil. I use that all the time for little skin irritations. It's cool to think it might actually be tweaking my immune response at the same time.
It's possible. Research suggests that tea tree oil can actually change how immune cells behave, sometimes boosting the immune response, sometimes suppressing it, depending on the situation.
So it's like this multi-talented immune modulator switching up its strategy based on what's going on.
Exactly. And that makes it a really promising candidate for developing new treatments for all sorts of things. Skin infections, maybe even autoimmune diseases.
That's amazing. Are there other essential oils that have shown similar effects on the immune system?
There are a few. Lavender oil, for example, another popular one, known for its calming and anti-inflammatory effect.
Lavender, I love the smell of lavender. It's so relaxing.
And that relaxing effect might actually be linked to its ability to affect the immune response. Studies show that lavender oil can suppress the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, those signaling molecules that drive inflammation, remember?
Right. So it's like lavender oil is whispering, calm down to the immune system. I love that image.
Exactly. And because of its potential to calm down that inflammatory response, lavender oil might be a good therapeutic option for things like allergies, asthma, even autoimmune diseases.
Wow, this whole conversation has really changed how I think about the sense of smell. It's not just about enjoying nice scents. It's a really powerful sensory system that can have a huge impact on our health and well-being.
I totally agree. It's incredible how interconnected our senses are with our immune system and all the ways they can influence each other.
Well, this has been a totally unexpected but awesome deep dive into the world of olfactory immunity. We've covered so much today, from the tiniest molecular guardians in our cells to the surprising ways our senses can shape our immune responses. It really shows how connected everything in our bodies is.
It's been a fascinating journey, and it just goes to show how much we still have to learn about the incredible complexity of the human body.
I say this all the time, but it's worth repeating. Stay curious, everyone. There's a whole universe of amazing discoveries out there just waiting to be made, right inside our own cells and senses. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.